The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you. I'm happy to answer the member's question. As he says, yes, the digital services tax is a tax that came into effect on December the 1st of last year. That tax was introduced in the budget. It was activated through the passage of last year's BITSA, and the activation date, the in effect date, was December the 1st. So I can't give the member an annual or a number that would pertain to the entire fiscal year. But what I can tell him is that it is that tax that was attached to any streaming service that a Manitoban has. So it is meant to apply to services to Manitobans. That means if you're a Netflix subscriber, your bill now contains the PST. If you subscribe to Amazon Prime, then you pay the PST on that. The initial assumption on an annual year was $25 million of revenue, but there is no place in the public accounts where it breaks that amount out. On page 66, of course, you see the revenue consolidated statements, and it includes that line for the retail sales tax, and this would be the impact of this would be in there. Next year, we will have the data from a full year of this particular tax. But I would make one other point clear, and that is the company itself, it does not have to distinguish between its the tax it pays online sales and, like, in other words, non-streaming services and this tax. So there's not going to be a way to parse out that number that the member wants. The estimate, of course, $25 million per year, have been collecting since December the 1st.
The member for Fort Garry.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister, for the answer. Now, you indicated obviously that it applies to streaming services, which Amazon Prime is obviously one. But does it also apply to digital marketplace services like just the Amazon website or the Costco website or major retailers like Hudson's Bay and all that? Are they paying PST? And the reason why I'm questioning the minister about this, I've met with the small business community in Manitoba, and they would like to have a level playing field for commerce, and they often what they called what's the expression? Showrooming, where people will go into their bricks and mortar stores, they look around, and then they go home and buy the exact same product on Amazon. And of course, Manitoba loses out on the PST. So I'm wondering if you could explain the scope of the tax, whether it would cover those type of transactions. And if it doesn't, is there plans in the future to quote unquote level the playing field to make sure that they do?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you. I appreciate the member's question. Yes, the entire rationale behind the government's moves have been to address exactly the concerns that the members raising, and that is we don't want a system whereby there are additional benefits accruing to companies who sell online against which people with brick and mortar and who have a footprint in Manitoba are competing. They don't want to be at a disadvantage. And previous to the changes that our government brought, there was that unlevel playing field. The member talks about that showrooming. I've heard this myself from my children who are consumers and living in different provinces, and they talk about this practice of going in and trying something, even buying it, and then returning it and buying it online. So we're trying to stamp out exactly that type of behavior. The changes he's referring to are called the online marketplaces. It's a tax on online marketplaces. He will see in last year's budget a 2021-2022 fiscal impact of $3.3 million was the budget, and essentially requiring online marketplaces to collect and remit retail sales tax on the sale of taxable goods sold by third parties on their electronic platforms. It came into effect December the 1st. So that is in addition to the streaming services application of tax. And I would also want to include that the same principle is applied to online booking services of hotels. So the same practice has been extended. All of these, as the member says, for the purpose of leveling the playing field. Clearly in my conversations and ongoing dialogue with the retail industry and various stakeholder groups, these are concerns they have raised in the past. They are pleased to see the work made to level the playing field. These same types of changes are going on in other jurisdictions in Canada as well.
The member for Fort Garry.
So if I understand the minister correctly, then, Amazon Marketplace would get covered by this, and if he can confirm that. But given that we have put these measures in place, I would assume that these large multinational corporations have to open up at least a PST tax account in the province of Manitoba. So then I guess my next question would be do they also have opened up a corporate tax account? And do these companies pay corporate tax in Manitoba, or do they only pay PST as part of this tax initiative?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
I'm happy to respond to the member's question. Of course, the government, has the concern that the member is citing, and that is to create level playing conditions to be able to incentivize people to bring their business to Manitoba, to support our retailers in this province who sell goods to Manitobans. And so to the member's question, is there a registration process by which online retailers register, to essentially open an RST account or an RST registration? The answer is yes. So these retailers, we have to have a way, of course, to be able to have this tax remitted, and that is the process by which that is done. When it comes to the test of corporate, then the member is referring to practices that belong to the federal government, Canada Revenue Agency. Those determinations go down to the test of corporate presence, and that is a federal process to test whether a company has a corporate presence in a jurisdiction. That corporate presence could be determined by real estate and warehouses and other operations. There would be other ways to test against that threshold of corporate presence. I am aware, as the member will be as well, that there's ongoing work within Canada and indeed beyond the borders of Canada, led through the OECD, to determine how digital services tax could be assessed to online sellers of goods who have activities globally, and what is that principle of taxation that should be applied to create fair conditions in which these companies are not using advantages that they would have at that level, scale, and size of operation to be able to skirt obligations that brick and mortar retailers and companies would have in jurisdictions. So that work continues. I would say to you that Manitoba is engaged in that work to the extent that we, of course, have shared tables for taxation and taxation reform and ongoing work. My work as the Minister of Finance representing this province at the table for the federal, territorial, provincial meetings. We have discussed issues like this in the past, and I know that the next time that we gather, it would surprise me if this issue was not once again raised in some form.
The member for Fort Garry.
I appreciate this dialogue with the minister. So if I'm hearing him correctly, and perhaps he can confirm it, despite Amazon having so much business in Manitoba that they've opened up several large warehouses, they are not paying corporate tax in Manitoba for the profits that are generated in Manitoba. And at the same time, Manitoba small businesses are required to compete against them while being required to pay corporate taxes in Manitoba. So I assume I've just characterized the state of things in Manitoba. I would assume that the minister would find that problematic, and I'm very interested in his plans to address this and to sort of correct the market.
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you. I'm happy to respond to the member's question and to correct the record. There's a number of wrong assertions he makes. I want to be clear at the outset, though, that as the Minister of Finance, I won't name names. It would not be prudent for me to be identifying companies by name. Member is welcome to do so. I need to be more careful than that just in terms of disclosures. However, to the member's question, we were talking about the federal government and the CRA's responsibility to determine things like corporate presence. As soon, in the example that the member raises, as soon as there is a physical warehouse within the jurisdiction of Manitoba, that is a corporate presence. So that corporate presence has then been established. And so as, let's say it's a warehouse, and then as goods would flow into the warehouse and be distributed to Manitobans, then those goods would become subject to our retail sales tax. But also, that same warehouse is paying all those other taxes. I think importantly for the member's question, that warehouse then is subject to corporate income tax. But that warehouse is also then subject to payroll tax, retail sales tax, of course, property tax, and the education property tax. These are all taxes that that company will then pay. The test, though, of that the federal government determines in terms of what portion of the activities within that warehouse are taxable in Manitoba, that's still a federal determination. In other words, let's say that warehouse ships goods to Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, and BC. Only the goods that are distributed to Manitobans, stores, or retail outlets, or to customers at the end of that queue, only those amounts would then be subject to the retail sales tax. All those other taxes still apply.
The member for Fort Garry.
I guess the natural follow-up question is so if you have a multinational retailer who just does business online and all the products are delivered through some type of courier service and they don't have a physical location in the province of Manitoba, we would not be assessing corporate tax on those transactions. Do I have that correct?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
So the member is probing an area that's important for tax law, because as the world increasingly shifts to these online modalities for buying goods, it is a challenge that every jurisdiction, every Canadian province and territory has to grapple with. So a few key points I'll just make for the member. First of all, our rules are in no respect different than other provinces or territories. Second principle, it is the constitutional prerogative and responsibility of the federal government to assess corporate income tax. It is not a provincial prerogative. The next point I would make is that we cannot assess, essentially we cannot glean tax from an operation that does not exist in Manitoba. So if Bombardier is located in Quebec, we can't apply PST to Bombardier if their operations are all in Quebec because they don't operate in Manitoba. But if there were, by the same argument, if there's a warehouse in Vancouver or Lethbridge or Regina, and they send goods into Manitoba, of course, PST assessed at the border. It's the same principle when if you purchase a car in Calgary and then you bring it to Manitoba and you go to register that vehicle, they say, oh, well, wait, you haven't paid your sales tax in the jurisdiction. So the principle cuts both ways. But as I said, corporate income tax, yes, the moment there's a corporate presence in Manitoba, corporate income tax, all these other taxes apply. Of course, the post-secondary health tax, the payroll tax, the property tax, education tax, corporate income tax, personal income tax for people who work at that warehouse, all of those taxes intact. Though I will just once again reference the fact, but jurisdictions continue in cooperation to continue to talk about tax fairness. And this is work that Manitoba will continue to participate in because we want to see good investments in the province of Manitoba. We want businesses to create their businesses here. And indeed, only yesterday, we were citing confidence that banks are expressing in Manitoba as a jurisdiction in which to do business, a improving taxation jurisdiction, a jurisdiction that's improving on its regulatory burden and the progress that this government is making against that cost of red tape to businesses and industries and individuals and organizations and nonprofits who are doing business and interacting with the government. And of course, we have our other advantages as well that we have built in. A low unemployment rate in the past has been a real source of strength for us. Of course, right now we are concerned when employers tell us that they cannot find the necessary workforce. But this is why our government has been working so hard to create the conditions in which Manitoba and Manitoba businesses can succeed. And I would call to the members' attention both sections of the budget and sections of the public accounts that talk about the progress that we are making in that regard. The strategic outcomes and strategic infrastructure investments portion of the public accounts actually talks about ways in which we are building our economy, investing in our communities, making life more affordable, and how we are modernizing government. As a matter of fact, yesterday we spoke about that modernization of government. The member was wondering about why send a check instead of doing something in a more progressive manner, and you will see there all kinds of illustrations on page 17 of how we are moving to a modernized government environment, which includes the adoption of technologies. And part and parcel of that is, of course, the balanced scorecard implementation that is a part and a portion of the documents that we're considering today.
The member for Fort Garry.
On page 44 of the budget document, effective May 1st, 2022, fuel used in off-road operations of peat harvesting equipment is now exempt from the fuel tax. And I'm wondering if the minister could answer a few questions on that. First of all, why was this measure necessary? How much will it cost the Treasury and lost tax revenue? Who advocated for this? Who was asking for this measure? And I would like to hear the minister's comments because it seems rather inconsistent with our climate change goals. And isn't there a concern that a fossil fuel subsidy could prevent these companies from innovating and finding new ways to harvest without the use of fossil fuel processes? And we're actually doing these companies a disservice by holding them back with an artificial corporate welfare subsidy. So if you could address those, that would be much appreciated.
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you for the member for the question. I'll see if I can get to all the component parts of his question. First of all, the impact clearly stated in the budget that the budgeted amount was $200,000 was with the anticipated impact. Thanks. I'll get to that in a second. Thank you. The actual industry itself of peat harvesting is actually a success story for Manitoba. It was an area of learning for me as the finance minister to discover that peat harvesting in Manitoba is very, very important. We're a major exporter of peat and peat products to areas like horticulture, gardening centers, all across North America. I understand that a major export of peat goes to places like Texas. So we're very, very pleased to see that this sustainable industry is located in Manitoba. Sustainable practices, of course, are in place to make sure that the industry is safeguarded and that supply is regenerated. This industry employs people in Manitoba. It generates corporate income tax and personal income tax and all the other taxes we've talked about. In terms of the consistency of the exemption, so the members, of course, referring to the fact that in other sectors as well, the government exempts fuels used in off-road operations to be able to incentivize industry and job creation and to help the province grow. So in respect of peat harvesting equipment, the member will see on page 176 of the budget that marked fuel can be currently purchased tax exempt when used in off-road machinery and equipment utilized by farming, and in Manitoba for mining, and commercial logging, and commercial fishing, and trapping. And we are simply by this measure extending the exemption to peat harvesting equipment, supporting this important industry in Manitoba. It is consistent with the tax treatment in the majority of Canadian jurisdictions. It was brought to us by the industry. The peat harvesting industry made this application. They asked for this treatment, and indeed, they cited that principle of fairness and said, we are no less important than other sectors. You have this treatment in other sectors. It was never done by the former NDP government, but our PC government was proud to bring this change that recognizes this industry and takes this modest step in terms of tax treatment in order to, I would suggest, in order to generate multiples in terms of taxation as this company grows and can forego some of that cost it previously had to pay.
The member for Fort Garry.
Minister, on May 5th, 2022, DeFir announced through the media that they were closing their plant on August 10th. 220 family supporting jobs will be lost. I'm wondering if the province was aware of the closure prior to that date, if there had been any discussions with the owners about the closure, whether any alternatives have been explored to the closing, including a worker buyout of the plant, and has the government reached out to any of the employees, and is there any plan in place to deal with such a massive loss of manufacturing jobs? And is there any strategy in place to address the shrinking manufacturing base in Manitoba?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
I think it was Mark Twain who famously said at one point, the rumors of his death were greatly exaggerated. And I would say to this member that the rumors of a manufacturing decline are completely false in Manitoba. I don't know why the gloom and doom from the member, but he obviously hasn't read the budget. And he obviously has not been paying attention in Manitoba. And so I really welcome the opportunity to talk about the growth of manufacturing in the province of Manitoba. Certainly, even I'll take this rare opportunity to speak at a local level as a member of the Legislative Assembly that represents the area of Morden-Winkler. I would invite the member to Morden-Winkler and see how manufacturing right now is busting out. And I'm talking about both manufacturing of things like agriculture equipment in my area of the province, but also manufacturing in things like plastics. Icon Technologies is a company in the city of Winkler that just recently completed a 50,000 square foot addition that is coming 2 years after a 50,000 square foot addition that is coming 2 years after a 200,000 square foot build, to a company that is really uniquely placed, that manufactures custom parts for the entire RV industry and exports them globally. This is just one small example of manufacturing. Manufacturing has been a hub in Manitoba. So I'll answer a question in specific, and then I'll go to the more general outlook, because he referred to that gloomy outlook, and I welcome the opportunity to correct the record. I know the DeFair company. Of course, we're disappointed to hear that the company is pivoting, but I would inform him that to the one question he asks, of course, there would have been notice to the government, because there would be a requirement in statute for a company with greater than 50 employees to make those plans known to the minister, however, not to this minister. That would have been the minister responsible for labor. And so that minister would have received that notice. I don't know in what time preceding the public announcement. Nevertheless, page 111 in the budget clearly shows that as the COVID-19, as businesses were coming out of COVID-19, we had a very, very strong year of growth, including in the area of manufacturing. As a matter of fact, manufacturing sales are reported in this budget from December 21st as being 11.8% up. So I'm directly refuting the member's doom and gloom that somehow manufacturing, he says, is on the decline in Manitoba. It is only on the decline in his own mind. When you actually look at the facts, manufacturing sales are up 11.8%. It might be one of the largest jumps year to year recorded in the province in the last 20 years. That's in addition to the second lowest annual unemployment rate last year, reported at 6.4%. That's in addition to the record-setting retail sales topping $24.1 billion. That's in addition to the largest farm cash receipts in history, beating last year's record by $1.3 billion. Farm cash receipts annual growth ranks first in the country at 19.3%. And as I said, record-breaking manufacturing sales. I'm going to read a sentence from page 111 under Economic Review. Record-breaking manufacturing sales eclipsed the $20 billion mark for the first time in Manitoba's history. I then cite for him, as I carefully watch the clock, page 52, examples of large and medium-scale projects that were completed, underway, or announced in 2021, including manufacturing projects there as well. So I would say to the member, it is exactly this government's leadership that is helping businesses, of course, and industries do the heavy lifting, but they need the conditions in which they can succeed, and this government is working hard to create the conditions in which employers can build, can expand, can reinvest in their businesses and in their people and in training, and we will continue to do so while the member claims without any evidence somehow that the sky is falling, where we say as a government that indeed the sky is the limit when it comes to manufacturing.
The member
I like that.
the member for Fort Garry.
Thank you, Minister. Now, other provinces have been attempting to support Ukraine by looking at how their economies contribute to the Russian economy and by divesting from it. As the minister knows, Manitoba has a number of provincially controlled pension funds. Crown corporations also have billions in equities. Alberta has done a review of what investments are under provincial control in order to divest from any equities that are Russian backed. Has any initiative been done in Manitoba to assess Russian held equities? And if not, would the province commit to undertaking such a review and commencing that divestment?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you. I welcome the opportunity to respond to the member's question. The member is referring to sanctions related to Russia. He's referring to the Special Economic Measures Act, which is a federal order in order to respond to the gravity of Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. Those regulations are in place. They impose an asset freeze and dealings prohibition on designated persons. There's a schedule that lists those persons. It includes both individuals and entities, and it is prohibited for any person in Canada and any Canadian outside Canada to do a few things. Number one, to deal in any property, wherever it's situated, held by or on behalf of a designated person whose name is on that list, enter into or facilitate a transaction related to such a dealing, provide any financial or other related services in respect to such a dealing, make any goods wherever situated available to the designated person, or provide any financial or related service to or for the benefit of a designated person. Those persons are listed. That makes them inadmissible to Canada under the Immigration Act, and it imposes restrictions on certain sectors, such as the financial and energy sectors. With some exceptions, they prohibit a person in Canada and Canadians abroad from dealing in new debt, and it goes on into other various sub-areas. So I want to make clear to the member that Manitoba fully cooperates and is fully engaged in the work that is led by the federal government, and that work that proceeds from the enactment exactly of this Special Economic Measures Act. RCMP investigates in Manitoba because we are a financial hub in Canada. Our diverse economy does include a very significant financial hub. We know companies that are located here in Manitoba continue to headquarter here in Manitoba, companies like Canada Life and companies like Investors Group and People's Corp and other companies as well. The credit unions, of course, that are both regulated in Manitoba and exist here. All of these groups, financial institutions, investment companies, they would all have to essentially comply, identify any products, any transactions that would have anyone listed on them in this schedule that is attached to the federal order. And so I can tell the member that everything is in place, that continues to help us identify if there are Russian interests to make sure that Russia does not profit in Manitoba in a way that would advantage them in the conflict that continues in Ukraine. I want to, though, take the last part of my answer to indicate to him or give him an update on Manitoba's response to the Ukraine crisis. And I know this member in the past has criticized this province, and he said we were not doing enough, and we weren't paying enough, and we weren't acting fast enough. And I reflect today that I think it was only a few weeks ago that a federal minister, I think it was Minister LeBlanc, called Manitoba's response the gold standard in Canada. And I want to flag at this point in time the excellent work of the Deputy Minister's task force that was struck to be able to coordinate this government's measures and response. My secretary to the Treasury Board sits on that task force, and as does the Deputy Minister for Intergovernmental Relations, Yanu Bota, who many people will know from his key role in emergency measures organization, helping to lead the fight on COVID-19, and many others. But essentially right now, Manitoba has already welcomed 10,000 people, 3 times our per cap size. We have processed 6,000 Manitoba health cards. There are record numbers of Ukrainians arriving. That number continues to increase. Hundreds of hotel rooms used every single day, and efforts will continue to help resettle Ukrainians into Manitoba.
The member for Fort Garry.
Okay. I think the minister may have misunderstood my question. There are provinces in Canada doing more, much more than Manitoba. And I cited an example. The province of Alberta has done a review of the equities under their control in order to see what Russian equities are under provincial control in Alberta for the express purpose of divesting from the Russian economy. It is now 7 months after the invasion, so I take it from the minister's response, Manitoba has not done that review, and Manitoba has no plans to divest from the Russian economy. But I also want to ask the minister, because this is going to be my last question before I turn it over to my colleague, is that we know, it's been reported in the media, that there are Russian oligarch assets in Manitoba, that they control a manufacturing plant here in the city of Winnipeg. These are individuals who are on the federal sanctions list. So I'm going to ask the minister, has, after 7 months, this government done a scan to advise itself of what Russian oligarch assets are present in Manitoba, and is there a plan to address, Russians, basically oligarchs benefiting from the Manitoba economy, and why has it taken 7 months to address it?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to respond to the member's question and to clear up the record. The member indeed actually wrote to me on this issue, and I wrote back to him to clear up any misunderstandings that he had on the issue of seizure and forfeiture of Russian assets. In that letter to, I can't use his name, in that letter to the member for Fort Garry, I indicated that under the Special Economic Measures Act, everyone in Canada and all Canadians outside the country must inform the RCMP of any property in their possession or control that is believed to be owned or controlled by an individual or entity placed on Canada's sanctions list, the list that I just referenced now. I indicated to him in that letter that our government recognizes this sensitive matter. I advised him that Manitoba Justice was working with the RCMP in respect to the new sanction when required. I indicated to him that in October of 2019, we had actually amended the Corporations Act to require privately held corporations to track beneficial ownership information and eliminate the use of bearer warrants. I was at the table in Canadian finance at the federal provincial table to have these conversations on better rules for beneficial ownership that actually preceded the Russian conflict. I think then probably in part prompted by the initial act of aggression of Russia against Ukraine in its annexation of the peninsula. I indicated to the member in this letter that we as a province continue to participate at the FPT table going forward. And then I said to the member, rest assured that the Manitoba government's unwavering support for Ukraine continues. I cited to him the work of the Deputy Minister's Committee that I cited today. I talked about our support of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and of other organizations. But I think in addition to these things, I want to make clear to the member, he has cited activities in Alberta, but he got it wrong. Because Alberta did not take action in respect of companies. Alberta took action to terminate relationships that it had forged economically with 3 Russian regions. So it used the opportunity to terminate that those relationships from a business standpoint. It rescinded those relationship letters, and they did it in order to demonstrate their support of Ukraine. Let me indicate to the member clearly, he's not the RCMP. This is the work of the RCMP to investigate. If the member has knowledge of Russian oligarchs operating in Manitoba, then he should report those suspicions to the RCMP. He shouldn't bring them to the committee table for the estimates of expenditure for finance. Get busy and phone 911 and inform the RCMP of your suspicions. So I have to caution him, if he's aware of anything that securities regulators, the credit unions and their regulator, that the disclosures made by banks and lending institutions and life insurance companies and other groups headquartered in Manitoba that they haven't gotten to, well, the member has an obligation then to make his suspicions known to the RCMP. But for the purposes of the act that I referenced, this federal act, the value of these companies and these assets is listed at 0. They cannot be sold. They cannot be traded. They cannot be divested. They are frozen in order to ensure that those activities economically cannot continue in such a way to advantage Russia in this time of conflict. Let me simply conclude my answer by stating, as I did, that the response of Manitoba is being heralded the Deputy Minister's Committee. I thank the many civil servants who are actively engaged in the work, both at the Welcome Center in Winnipeg, facilitating hotel rooms, doing transactions like per diems, making payments, scheduling medical appointments. This work continues, though, in other places, in Steinbach, in Portage-la-Prairie, in Dauphin, in Winkler, in Morden, in Selkirk, in Gimli. I know that we're welcoming Ukrainians there as well.
The member for St. James.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We will be switching our focus to hydro, so I don't know, I want to offer the minister an opportunity to change staff if needed and let them, that's fine. I'd like to keep it as brief as possible, but.
It's agreed to recess for 3 minutes. I'm sorry? No recess. There will be no recess. The member for St. James.
It's great to be here in person again, to have an opportunity to discuss hydro, face to face with the minister. And I want to say off the top, just grateful to all the department staff and others who are here to support him today. Looking forward to an open and transparent conversation on Manitoba Hydro. I'd like to start by building off of some of the things that were raised today in the House earlier, beginning with the Brad Wall report. I'd like to ask the minister, this report was commissioned by his government. The report ended up delivering 51 recommendations. And this government actually offered a directive to Manitoba Hydro to support the implementation of all of those recommendations. And we know that a project group was announced, which was given accountability for instituting or implementing those recommendations. And I'm just hoping that the minister can provide us with an update on the work that's been done to implement the 51 recommendations that were put forward in the Brad Wall report.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I welcome the member to the table and look forward to our discussion on finance. We just talked about on hydro, the duties of which now fall to me and form part of my responsibilities that include both hydro chair of the Treasury Board and finance. I want to also welcome to the table at this point in time another official who I will identify. Rob Maurice is seated with me at the table. He is the ADM, the Assistant Deputy Minister for Fiscal Policy and Corporate Services, and has responsibilities in this Crown Corporations Secretariat. So with the movement in government to assign Crown corporations under the responsibility of ministers We no longer have the Department of Crown Services, but we still have staff, senior staff, and the expertise retained and works within a secretariat which resides within my department. I'm happy to have a conversation about the expert report on kiosk and BIPOL, a report that was published in 2020 November by the Commissioner, a broad and deep diving report based on public documents from the Public Utilities Board, Clean Environment Commission, internal reviews performed by Hydro, documents from Hydro and the government, interviews and written submissions of past and present Hydro executives, Government of Manitoba current and retired elected members, Government of Manitoba staff, other stakeholders in the Genesis project plan development, approval, and construction of the kiosk generating station and BIPOL 3 transmission line and converter stations, and as well, of course, a set of recommendations that the member refers to that come from that body of work. I understand thousands of hours of interviews, thousands of pages of review, and the report itself in its full form, I believe, is thousands of pages as well. I have the executive summary in front of me this afternoon. I want to first clear up the record. I know what the member and his party have been trying to do to somehow say the government has solicited for this advice in this expert report, and now the government is beholden to do everything on the list. And he's wrong. The government seeks advice all the time. I think far more so than the NDP ever did. I can even recall reports like a major one on procurement that was delivered to the former government in 2014 that they never read. The minister at the time said he never read the report. He got a report on procurement, I think from PricewaterhouseCoopers, paid the bill but never touched the report. We found it on a shelf. We implemented it. We actually looked at it and it talked about shopping smarter. And we said, that's a great report. And we called them up and asked if we could re-engage in the work, and we did so. So we know that the previous government was not good about taking advice. We've taken advice in numerous areas. Today in the House, there was a reference to the Virgo report. There was, of course, the David Peachy report on healthcare that has largely helped guide a better consolidation of health services in Manitoba that every expert for 20 years has agreed were too distributed, were too complex, and were too top-heavy, too much administration, and not enough emphasis on the delivery of services. So, and in all of those cases, government has received those reports. I'm thinking right now of the Lynn Stevenson report. I actually signed that contract with Lynn Stevenson, who came into Manitoba during COVID-19 at a very, very tragic time where we saw happening in Manitoba what had happened elsewhere. With a very, very sudden surge, wave of COVID cases in personal care homes who needed more understanding of how to respond. And Lynn Stevenson wrote her Stevenson report at the time. So I have before me the expert report on BIPOL and kiosk. And what is clear in the directive that was referred to this afternoon, respecting Manitoba's response to their project, is that the directive provides instruction to Manitoba Hydro to support development and implementation of Manitoba's response. Manitoba's response to the 51 recommendations, which is a different thing than saying Manitoba's implementation verbatim of the 51 recommendations.
The member for St. James.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to read to the minister the directive that was issued by his government, which he just took or quoted a small piece from, just so that it's on the record and it's clear the level of commitment that his government made to enacting all 51 recommendations. The purpose, this directive provides instruction to Manitoba Hydro to support development and implementation of Manitoba's response to the 51 recommendations outlined in Commissioner Bradwell's report on the economic review of Manitoba Hydro kiosk and BIPOL 3 projects. Application and scope, this directive applies to the work of the assigned provincial project team and external panel in developing a formal response to the recommendations outlined in the Commissioner Wall's report. Scope of work to be supported by Manitoba Hydro includes assessment of the 51 recommendations from the report, determination of an action plan for each, including stakeholder engagements, ongoing evaluation processes, and prescribed reporting mechanisms and implementation activities where applicable. The directive, Manitoba Hydro is directed to take all steps necessary to support the work of the assigned provincial project team and external expert panel in developing Manitoba's formal response to recommendations outlined in Commissioner Bradwell's report on the economic review of Manitoba Hydro Kiosk and Bipole 3 projects. Concluding, Manitoba Hydro will support the assigned project team and external expert panel in conducting their assessment of the 51 recommendations from the report. Here's the important part, Minister: development and implementation of required action plans and required reporting mechanisms as determined by government. So I think it's clear in reviewing the directive that was issued by the Minister's government that there was clearly a directive to implement and to develop plans on how to implement reporting mechanisms for all 51 recommendations. And we are clearly hearing some concern, or that this government is getting cold feet about some of the recommendations in the report. Yesterday in media, he mentioned something along the lines that he liked the report and it had some good recommendations, but we seem to be seeing a real walking back of what his government had originally directed Hydro to do in support of implementing those recommendations. And so I'd ask the minister, I guess, at this point, if he's not interested in implementing all of the recommendations, and he doesn't intend on ensuring that all 51 are implemented, which of the 51 recommendations are currently being worked on?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Yeah, the member has trouble, and that's his prerogative. But it's exactly as I stated. I've got a copy of the directive in front of me right now. It's a public document. There is a clear reference to the fact that hydro should support development and implementation of Manitoba's response to the 51 recommendations of the Commissioner's report. It indicates the directive applies to the work of the assigned provincial project team, which I'll speak in just a second, and the external panel in developing a formal response to the recommendations. And the scope of the work supported by Hydro includes an assessment of the 51 recommendations, a determination of an action plan for each of the recommendations, including stakeholder engagements, ongoing evaluation processes, and prescribed reporting mechanisms and implementation activities where applicable. And then it says Manitoba Hydro will take the steps to support the work of the provincially assigned project team and the expert panel. So exactly as I said, the government solicits for advice from experts. The government has received this report on bipole and kiosk and what went wrong. And the government has said to Hydro, we will work together at building a stronger framework, and I can't wait to get the discussion of actually what the recommendations say. I welcome the members' interest in it. I hope he has read the report, and I hope he understands our shared interest as a legislature in creating stronger safeguards for major capital projects, especially at Hydro. I hope that he is willing to be a mechanism and a means by which his party comes to actually face the cold, harsh truth of the ways in which they hid information of Manitobans, hid project cost escalations knowingly from the regulator because they knew that those cost escalations at that time would factor largely into the decision of that regulator. Hid cost escalations in the billions of dollars for Manitobans, entered into contracts that assigned risk inappropriately back to Hydro and away from contractors, mismanaged the business case that supported, I should say, the actual creation of these assets. I can recall when these conversations started and former ministers of the NDP government talking about this as Manitoba's oil. And my members at the table will recall Manitoba's oil, that this was our oil that we would essentially put into markets. They said, they promised Manitobans that these assets, when created, would cost ratepayers nothing. So I do welcome the members' interest in principle in this area of examination. I think it is key for us as legislators to be able to grapple with the content. I think it is reckless, I think it is obtuse to somehow say there are no good pieces of advice that came from thousands of interviews and thousands of documented pages of testimony, talking to hundreds of expert witnesses. It seems the NDP way to dismiss that. It certainly isn't ours. Governance of this project, the purpose of the expert panel that he referred to is to provide advice, guidance, and direction to the interdepartmental project team responsible for developing the action plan. I can make the member aware that that panel consisted of Mark Podlasley, Tim Stanley, Chris Gower. I have met with this group. I have exchanged information. I have asked them the status of their work. Their work has now concluded. They have provided their advice back to the working group. The working group is analyzing that information. Their work largely centered around capital projects and procurement. And there will be other whole areas I'll speak to in my next response. Oh yeah, I have this.
The member for St. James.
I appreciate the last part of the answer there. I'd like just to simply ask the minister then to elaborate on that and just to share what that working group is focused on. Which recommendations are forming the focus of their work?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Yes, I'm happy to continue my response where I left off. So that expert panel, and I just indicated the membership of that group, I'd be happy to share the impressive biographies of this work as well, because remember, in rejecting this entire expert report, that member is also rejecting the 120 years of combined expert capability, experience, and capacity of this leadership group. And I would be really happy to talk about the fact that Mark Podlasley is the Director of Economic Policy at the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. This member, by discounting the entire report, is discounting this individual's capacity and expertise. Tim Stanley is an engineer and president at Stratus Consulting. Chris Gower is an engineer and former president of project delivery at Infrastructure Ontario. So by rejecting en masse all the recommendations, the NDP are on record. This member is on record as saying this report has absolutely no value. He says the people who worked on this report have no credibility. They've said it in the House. Mark Podlasley, he says, Tim Stanley, Chris Gower. I've met these individuals. I've shared time with them. I'm incredibly impressed with the depth of knowledge, the sincerity with which they have approached this exercise, the earnestness with which they have applied themselves and delivered back information for consideration. So I would caution the member when he's reflecting so incautiously on this 2-year body of work, that he's very, very incautiously dismissing experts that are on the Canadian landscape, who consult across the world, who, one of these individuals told me about his work, I think on 3 different continents. Very impressive. Seeing capital projects up close and personal. And what I was able to learn in my short time with them is there are ways you can do this better. There are, as in everything, best practices that can be observed. There are ways to manage risk, even of these proportions. There are ways to test better for project progress against completion deadlines. There are ways to enter into better agreements with contractors to translate that risk and penalty and accountability back to them. It wasn't done in this case. And in some cases, I remember those individuals saying to me, it should have been obvious. It should have been obvious because these things they're complex, but they're not rocket science. In other words, though, I wanted to go to the scope of their work because the member asked about it. So the scope of this work taken on by the expert panel was to provide direction and guidance and challenge the plans and actions of the project team. So it was essentially bolting on their expertise to this internal group, which would have included people in the Crown Services Secretariat here in government, people in the Department of Finance, people at Hydro, people at the Public Utility Board, and others as well. The parameters of their work included the decision to enter into cost reimbursable contracts. It included the impact of project labor agreements on project costs and the high proportion of construction work conducted by out-of-province companies, specific examination of contracts. And this I would love to spend an hour on with the critic, because this is a story that has not been adequately told in Manitoba. For years, the former premier, the former NDP premier, spoke about the incredible job creation at Kiosk. Only an hour ago in these proceedings, the former critic was talking about his concern about revenues not being realized in jurisdiction. Well, there's no greater example in the 21st century than on Kiosk, where so much of the workforce came from outside of Manitoba, and so much of that taxation was paid in other jurisdictions. I'm happy to continue to share with the member other parts of the panel's guiding principles and parameters of their examination.
The member for St. James.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's very disappointing to not get a clear answer on anything. I think people watching or anyone who's tuning into this would feel the same way. I think these responses are the kind of responses that make people feel disenchanted by the political world, by folks doing these jobs that we're doing. And I hope that the minister can endeavor to provide information and actually respond to questions that are being answered, because the questions I'm asking are important questions that I think Manitobans deserve the answers to, especially given the impacts, the potential impacts of the recommendations that were put forward by the Wall Report. And if they are to be implemented, there could be significant impacts on Manitoba Hydro, especially given some of the recommendations suggest things along the lines of selling off core assets, privatization, and contracting out. And I hope the minister can also understand why we would be skeptical of a report that was authored by an ex-Conservative premier. And not only was he the author of the report, he was the second ex-Conservative premier who was asked to lead the development of that report. So I hope you can understand why it might be a little difficult for us as the opposition to accept its recommendations. I'm sure inside there somewhere he understands our reasoning for that. I'm going to move on now to ask another question that's timely, that was in the media today relating to hydro, and that is the recent revelation that the minister is receiving input and advice from Mr. Sandy Riley. I'd like to ask the minister about the nature of the advice that he's being provided, and if he can comment on the type of matters that Mr. Riley is advising him on.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, I thank the member for the question, and I'll divide my time, and I'm happy to discuss further Mr. Riley's engagement with the government, but I did want to finish the answer I was providing to him that actually was giving the full scope of work of the expert panel. So the member suggests I'm obfuscating, but I'm actually reading into the record the scope of work of the expert panel. And that was the question he posed. What was the work of the expert panel, and what was their, paraphrasing, what were they supposed to examine, he said. So just to finish that answer, yes, the panel was asked to, of course, look into the work of construction companies who were out of province. The panel was also asked to provide input and guidance related to the examination of the Bipole 3 routing decision. Why a costlier west route through Manitoba than the less costly east route? and also asked to provide input and guidance on the failure of Hydro to disclose the escalating cost estimates for kiosks to the PUB, which I directly referenced in my previous response. In preparation for their work, the expert panel was told to review pertinent documents, consider best practices, which I referred to in my previous answer, and have access to relevant information and personnel in Manitoba Hydro as it relates to the scope of the work, which I referenced in my first response on Hydro this afternoon, reading from the preamble of the expert report. The timing is also mentioned. The member asked about timing, and it indicates here that a specific plan to address, notice that the term says to address each recommendation. It does not say a specific plan to implement each recommendation exactly as it is written. It doesn't say that. It's to address each recommendation to be given. And then it talks about the measurable progress and how measurable progress will be made. And then it talks about specific information on decisions to enter into cost reimbursable contracts, impacts of labor agreements, commenting on those things. So essentially going a lot towards the procurement side of the exercise. And then it talks at the end about a formal response document, publicly released, that basically updates the public and updates the critic as well in response to the Wall report. And again, it says in response to the Wall report. So I can indicate to that member that work is underway. This expert committee has essentially concluded its work, delivered its work to the task force or the working group that exists. They are considering that, and the update to Manitobans will come. And I won't read any more on that document. We can return to that subject as the member would like. On the subject of Mr. Sandy Riley and giving advice to government, yes, I mean, our government receives advice. It's not the only expert that we receive advice from, just a couple of public ones that the member will know of. Expert Advisory Panel in Environment, Climate, and Parks, formed November the 8th of 2018. The Student Advisory Council in Education, formed last year. The Minister's Advisory Committee in Seniors, I'm very proud to have a constituent who sits on that committee, formed in spring of this year. The Manitoba Immigration Advisory Council, formed in February of this year. And I have, as an advisor in Hydro, Mr. Sandy Riley. I'm guessing here, but I think probably Mr. Riley began to act in that capacity in March, maybe February, maybe March. I can go back and check my records. My special assistant who is here with us today, I must name him, Mr. Connor Very, can help me check to see when those dates are on the calendar. But essentially, why Mr. Riley? I think he's highly qualified to be acting in this capacity. He's a former board chair of Manitoba Hydro. He's an experienced and influential executive in Winnipeg's financial industry. He has extensive governance experience. He is a celebrated Manitoban, a recipient of the Order of Canada and the Order of Manitoba. He has belonged to the Fraser Institute, the Canada West Foundation, Allstream. He led the Pan American Games in Winnipeg in 1999, and we are happy to be working with him. We receive advice from Mr. Riley. He has signed confidentiality agreements. He meets with me on occasion, and I enjoy our conversations and our shared interest in stabilizing hydro and keeping rates low.
The member for St. James.
Yes, thank you. So I guess the concern here is that we've got people who are not accountable to Manitobans who are offering advice and are mysteriously working in the shadows here, providing information to the minister that will ultimately affect decision-making at Manitoba Hydro. And so again, I think it would be important for Manitobans to know, to understand what it is, or which areas that Mr. Riley is providing guidance on. This is of concern, of course, because as chair of Manitoba Hydro, Mr. Riley was responsible for Hydro bringing forward a 7.9% hydro rate increase during his time as chair. He had a particularly aggressive view of Hydro's finances and seem to want to drastically increase Hydro's revenues. And given this government's record on legislating hydro rate increases, raising costs on Manitobans, proposing yet another bill that will seek to legislate hydro rate increases on Manitobans, I hope the minister can understand why there's some concern about this individual and his perspectives coming to once again influence decision-making at Hydro. So I'd ask the minister again if he can clarify which areas specifically Mr. Riley is providing guidance on to him as minister.
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
What I find particularly interesting today is the concern put on the record today by the critic for Hydro, concern about the individual who I've tapped on the shoulder to provide advice from time to time because of his expertise and his background in business and his high standing in the community and his willingness to do so with no remuneration to simply be at the table and provide advice. Why? Because I think if people know Mr. Riley, they do understand that he sincerely loves this province and has spent his whole life building it. But why I find it concerning today at the table that the member expresses concern is that on December 2nd of 2020, his leader, who I can't name, but the leader of the opposition party said about Mr. Riley, led by respected business person Sandy Riley. And in October of 2020, his leader of the opposition said, gone are the days when you could have Sandy Riley, a well-respected man in the business community, somebody with a lot of expertise, somebody who I may not agree with at all times, but who was independent, end quote. But even more surprising than these quotations, which clearly state that the opposition has high regard for Mr. Riley, for his independence, for his business experience, even more surprising than that is that on December the 4th of 2019, this critic for Hydro said, and I quote, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if we look at what took place, I mean, frankly, the chair of this board, Mr. Sandy Riley, one of Manitobans' most well-known and respected business people, end quote. So it must be uncomfortable today for the member to learn that his own words in Hansard convict him. I thank the member for these representations of his support for this advisor of mine on issues pertaining to Hydro. I thank his leader for those indications of support, for his independence, and for his business experience. Somebody with a lot of expertise, it goes on to state. To the member's question about what kind of issues, well, there's a lot of issues that Hydro is facing. I think in the very first meeting I had with Mr. Riley, we ran a tally of what we thought were the fundamental challenges facing Hydro at this time. And indeed, probably every minister in this province responsible for Hydro since its inception has had a similar conversation with people. I've had that conversation with my deputy minister. I've had that conversation with senior officials in the government, with the assistant deputy minister, with the executive director. I've had that conversation with the CEO for Hydro. I've had that conversation with the previous board chair for Hydro. I've had that conversation with the current board chair for Hydro. So the member would understand that we have challenges in this province because of the NDP's massive over expenditures on capital projects that are now owing to a tripling of Hydro's debt in a space of time of less than 3 years, a debt that now sits at $24 billion. That's a challenge of Hydro that Mr. Riley and I discuss. We talk about the importance of energy policy. We talk about the work of Hydro to develop an integrated resource plan. We talk about the importance of the Public Utility Board in future having a better ability to guide and to oversee and adjudicate when a government decides it's time to create a new dam, and to test and to probe and to oversee and ask important questions on behalf of ratepayers to make sure that a government like the NDP isn't led away in their exuberance to do things that are not in the interest of ratepayers. We talk about the transition to green energy. We talk about electrification. We talk about the contracts with the U.S. States, including Wisconsin and Minnesota. We talk about spot markets. We talk about interest rates, and we talk about the need to keep rates low for Manitobans. Those are the things we talk about. But let's make one thing clear: the member has made a fundamental error. He said that it is Mr. Riley who makes decisions. Mr. Riley provides advice. Government, the minister, the chair, the CEO, and others make decisions for Hydro.
The member for St. James.
I appreciate the response from the minister. The minister will, of course, know that we can respect someone's role in our communities, business community, any community, and have significant disagreements with those people at the same time. And while Mr. Riley clearly has accomplished a lot, his perspective on Hydro's finances were put in question by the Public Utilities Board itself and the large number of independent experts who, in response to their 7.9% rate increase request, returned with a 3.8% rate increase. So the concerns there, I think, are just about the perspectives that he brings forward in terms of Hydro's finances. And those are perspectives that could have a significant financial impact on Manitobans at a time when many are facing an affordability crisis. And that worry persists regardless of the fact that he is an accomplished business person. I would like to move on to another area of concern. We seem to have 10 minutes remaining here. I want to ask the minister about Manitoba Hydro Telecom, which the minister will be familiar with, of course, as the minister responsible for Hydro. Manitoba Hydro Telecom was a subsidiary of Manitoba Hydro that was situated underneath the Manitoba Hydro International umbrella, as the minister would know. They were previously responsible for governing all of the fiber optic network that we've built across this province, connecting hydro stations, and for leveraging the fiber optic network to expand access to broadband for Manitobans across this province, especially in rural or northern regions. The minister will also know that his government has decided or saw fit to wind down Manitoba Hydro Telecom, a subsidiary that was earning significant amounts of revenue for Manitoba Hydro that helped to keep rates low, and that there are a number of major questions to be answered about the status of the handover of that fiber optic network, which was previously governed by Manitoba Hydro Telecom, over to ExploreNet. I'd like to ask the minister to offer this committee, offer us here a status update on the work of ExploreNet in expanding broadband access to Manitobans.
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
I thank the member for the question. I'm happy to provide a response to him. I do want to, and I don't say this in any way to obstruct, but I will advise the member that part of his interest will lie on this subject with the minister responsible for labor, consumer protection, and government services, because it is that department that holds the contract. But I'm happy to answer questions here. I did want to revert for 1 minute in the beginning of my answer, though, because I did not want to let an assertion that the member made earlier stand unrefuted. This government has brought no legislation that is intended to mandate or require the annual raising of hydro rates. We have brought a bill designed to do exactly the opposite. This government, he knows, has made pledges on keeping life affordable to Manitobans, and we are making those pledges real with things like a historic education property tax rebate to Manitobans, but also through our affordability payments we've just announced recently to families with children and seniors of low income. And part of that affordability pledge includes Bill 36. And Bill 36, I imagine, will be an area of our exploration in these proceedings. But we simply cannot start on the first day with these interactions with this false proposal that the member makes. I'm reading from the explanatory note of the bill, and it clearly says, because there is a section in this bill that deals with electricity rates and how those rates rise over time, but what it says is that when approving rates with this bill, the PUB is to be guided by Treasury Board-approved capital expenditure programs and government directives to hydro and debt to capitalization targets. And it says, and I think I'm reading from the wrong section. There we go. And then it says that the rate of increase for a year cannot exceed 5% or the rate of inflation, whichever is less. I think it is deplorable that the official opposition.
Order. I would just like to remind the minister that he's not allowed to be speaking about or referring to a bill that's currently before the legislature.
Mr. Chair?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
I have trouble accepting the guidance you're offering. I'm asking for a clarification because the member himself referenced Bill 36 only 10 minutes ago. Could you give me your advice again and indicate why the member could ask questions about Bill 36, but I could not respond to his questions on Bill 36? He clearly made a reference to the bill.
I would like to explain that the member for St. James mentioned Bill 36 within the context of a larger question. And what was the difference was that the minister was going into more detail, specifically about Bill 36. And that work is to be done in the standing committee.
Mr. Chair?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Could you please provide guidance to me on establishing parameters within which I can respond to the false allegation that the member made about the bill that he referenced and still comply with the clerk's wishes?
I would say to the Minister of Finance and just reiterate that the member for St. James did not ask a question specifically about Bill 36. He referenced it within the context of a larger question, and the minister is answering specifically and providing detail more specifically on 36, not the broader question. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Then I would broadly respond to the member and say that he mischaracterized the bill. And so without citing provisions from the bill, I would say the bill is designed to keep rates affordable. I hope that's within the parameters of what I can state without a direct reference to the name or number of the bill. I'm looking forward to our discussions that will continue over the next day and beyond at the members leading on the subject of bipoll, kiosk, and other concerns pertaining to the ExploreNet contract.
The member for St. James.
5 p.m.
Order. Hour being 5 p.m. Committee rise.